The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of failure. It settled in a fine, gritty film on everything: the warped planks of the boardwalk, the tired brim of Wyatt McGraw's hat, and the back of his own dry throat. He stood inside the Redemption Territorial Bank, the air thick with the smell of old paper-stale cigar smoke and the quiet desperation of men clinging to the frayed edges of their fortunes. For Wyatt, there was no fortune left to cling to. There was only the last of his savings, a meager stack of bills the teller was counting with practiced indifferent snaps of his thumb. Wyatt's gaze drifted past the teller to the street, where the midday sun bleached the color from the world, leaving a stark tableau of brown earth and pale sky. He was a ghost in this town, a man hollowed out by a memory he could neither outrun nor confront. The memory was a wildfire in his mind, always smoldering, and the slightest breeze of association could fan it into a roaring inferno. A child's laugh, the scent of wood smoke, the glint of silver in the sun, any of it could send him back to the Santa Fe Trail, to the choking dust and the screams that had been swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the plains. He had failed them, his wife Sarah, his son little Ben. He had frozen paralyzed by a disbelief so profound it had locked his limbs and stolen the air from his lungs. While others fought, he had watched a statue of a man, witnessing the destruction of his own world. The guilt was a physical weight, a yoke he'd worn for 5 long years. It had driven him from town to town, from job to job, a restless specter searching for an oblivion that never came. This money, the last of it, was for one final escape. A deed to a piece of forgotten land, so remote, so isolated, he hoped even his ghosts wouldn't be able to find him. "That's $87, Mr. McGraw," the teller said, pushing the worn bills under the brass grill. Wyatt nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the money. He felt the familiar chill creep up his spine, the precursor to the panic that lived just beneath his skin. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, unnatural silence that had fallen over the bank. The cheerful tick of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow louder, each second an eternity. Then the world shattered. The front doors of the bank burst open with a violent crash, and 3 men spilled inside, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. They moved with a brutal, rehearsed efficiency that spoke of long practice. One vaulted over the counter, his revolver leveled at the now terrified teller. Another stood guard by the door, his shotgun sweeping across the handful of petrified customers. The third man, the leader, moved to the center of the room. He was different from the others. He wore a tailored black coat, unbuttoned to reveal a silk vest, a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of his men. He moved with a dancer's grace, his posture calm, his presence radiating a cold, reptilian authority. He pulled down his bandana, revealing a handsome, cultured face, clean-shaven, save for a meticulously trimmed mustache. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, surveyed the room with an unnerving mixture of amusement and contempt. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth and educated, devoid of the grit and drawl of the West. "My name is Samuel Morrison, and this is a simple business transaction. Your full and immediate cooperation will ensure it remains so." Wyatt froze. The same ice that had flooded his veins on the Santa Fe Trail seized him now. His hand, which had been reaching for his savings, was locked in place. His own pistol, a Colt Peacemaker, felt 1,000 miles away, strapped to his hip, but utterly useless. He was a spectator again, trapped in the nightmare. He saw the frightened faces of the other customers and the tears streaming down a young woman's cheeks, the rigid posture of the bank manager trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. "The vault, if you please," Morrison said to the manager, his tone one of polite but absolute command. The manager, a portly man named Henderson, swallowed hard. I cannot." Morrison's smile was a thin, cruel line. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply nodded to the man behind the counter. The thug grabbed the young teller by his collar, pressing the barrel of his gun to the boy's temple. The teller, no older than 17, whimpered, his eyes wide with terror. "Perhaps you misunderstand the terms of our transaction," Mr. Henderson Morrison said conversationally. "My associate will count to 3. I highly recommend you find your motivation before he finishes." Wyatt's world narrowed to the bead of sweat tracing a path down the teller's pale cheek. "Do something!" A voice screamed inside his head. "Move, draw, don't let it happen again." But his body was a prison of stone. He could see Sarah's face in the teller's terrified eyes, Ben's innocence in the trembling of his hands. The past and present fused into a single, unbearable moment of failure. One Morrison's man grunted. Henderson fumbled with the keys on his belt loop, his hands shaking too badly to fit one into the lock. 2. "Please," the teller sobbed. "Please, I have a family." Morrison watched his expression unchanged, as if observing a mildly interesting insect. It was his detachment, his complete lack of humanity, that was the most terrifying thing about him. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the silence. Wyatt's hand twitched a pathetic aborted movement toward his gun. It was too late. He knew it was too late. A deafening crack echoed through the bank. The teller's body jerked and then slumped onto the counter, a spray of red painting the wall behind him. A woman screamed. Morrison didn't even flinch. He simply turned his cold gaze back to the bank manager. "The vault," he repeated, his voice as calm as if he'd just ordered a cup of tea. This time, Henderson moved his sobs, catching in his throat, as he unlocked the massive iron door. As Morrison's men began hauling sacks of money from the vault, Morrison's gaze swept the room again. It fell on the young woman who had screamed. She was clutching her throat where a silver locket hung from a delicate chain. It was the locket that broke Wyatt. It was a simple oval piece of silver, etched with a floral pattern identical in every way to the one he had given Sarah on their wedding day. The one he'd found lying in the dust next to her lifeless hand. Morrison's eyes glinted. He walked over to the woman, his steps silent and predatory. "A lovely piece," he murmured, his fingers tracing the outline of the locket. The woman shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. A memento, perhaps. Before she could answer, he gestured to the man at the door. "Jedediah, collect that for me. I've started a collection." The brute named Jedediah stomped over, ripped the locket from the woman's neck with a sharp tug that left a raw red mark, and tossed it to Morrison. Morrison caught it deftly, his thumbs stroking the silver surface as if it were a precious jewel. He gave the sobbing woman a final dismissive glance, and then turned to leave. As they backed out of the door, Morrison's pale eyes met Wyatt's across the room. For a brief, chilling moment, they held his gaze. There was no recognition, only a flicker of contempt for the man who stood frozen. His hand still hovering over the blood money on the counter, the man who had done nothing and who had done. The doors swung shut, leaving behind a wake of silence, death, and the suffocating stench of Wyatt's own cowardice. The spell broke. Air rushed back into his lungs in a ragged gasp. He stumbled backward, away from the counter, away from the dead teller, away from the accusing eyes of the living. He turned and fled, leaving his $87, the price of his future, behind on the polished wood. He didn't stop running until the dust of Redemption Gulch was a bitter memory in his throat, and the sun was a merciless hammer against his skull. He was running from Samuel Morrison. But more than that, he was running from himself. And he knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a grave marker that this time he could never stop. The journey was an act of self-flagellation. Wyatt pushed himself and his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Pilgrim, to the limits of their endurance. He rode through the endless expanse of sun-scorched earth, where the horizon shimmered with mirages of water and salvation that dissolved into heat and dust upon approach. The bone-dry wind whistled a lonely, mournful tune through skeletal mesquite trees and across cracked alkali flats. He ate sparingly, slept little, and spoke to no one, letting the oppressive silence of the plains scour him clean, but it couldn't touch the stain on his soul. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bank teller's face and the flash of Morrison's cold smile, the glint of the silver locket. He saw Sarah. He saw Ben. The images were a relentless torment, a constant reminder of his paralysis in the face of evil. He had failed to protect his family, and now he had failed to protect a stranger. The pattern was undeniable. He was a coward, a hollow man, defined by what he didn't do. This ranch was his last hope for penance, a self-imposed exile. If he couldn't face the world of men, he would remove himself from it entirely. He would live and die in a place where the only person he could fail was himself. The land agent in the territorial office had been a twitchy, sweat-stained man named Abernathy. When Wyatt had asked about the cheapest, most remote parcel available, Abernathy's eyes had lit with a desperate, greedy light. He'd unrolled a map and pointed a trembling finger to a square of land so far from any town or rail line it seemed to be falling off the edge of the world. The old Miller place, Abernathy had set his voice a conspiratorial whisper. Been on the books for years. Bank took it back after the last family. Left. They say the isolation gets to people. Drives them mad. He'd leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. Frankly, the bank's so tired of it, they'll take anything. $1, Mr. McGraw. $1 silver, and it's yours free and clear. The desperation in the agent's eyes should have been a warning. But Wyatt, consumed by his own demons, had seen only an escape hatch. He'd slapped a silver dollar on the counter, signed the deed without reading the fine print, and walked out before Abernathy could change his mind. After 3 days of hard riding, he found it. The property was even more desolate than he had imagined. It sat in a shallow basin, a collection of weathered gray buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the prairie. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cry of a distant hawk and the sighing of the wind. This, he thought with a grim sense of satisfaction, was a fitting tomb for a man who was already dead inside. He urged Pilgrim into a slow walk, his eyes scanning the property. The main house was a simple 2-story wooden structure, its paint long since peeled away by sun and sand. A barn stood nearby its roof, sagging in the middle like a tired old man's shoulders. A rusted windmill spun lazily its groan, a lonely counterpoint to the wind. It was perfect. A forgotten place for a forgotten man. Then he saw it. A thin ribbon of gray smoke curling from the stone chimney of the house. Wyatt pulled Pilgrim to a halt. He stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The deed said, abandoned. The agent had said abandoned. Yet the smoke was an undeniable sign of life, a ghost of a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. He dismounted, his senses on high alert. He moved forward on foot, his boots silent in the thick dust. As he drew closer, he saw more signs. A line of laundry dresses shifts, an apron snapped in the breeze stretched between the house and a gnarled cottonwood. The fabric was clean, smelling faintly of soap and sunshine. The windows of the house, which should have been boarded up or broken, were clean and intact. A rocking chair on the porch swayed gently, its rhythm suggesting someone had been sitting there only moments before his arrival. He reached the porch steps and heard it laughter. Soft, feminine voices drifting through the wooden walls like music from another lifetime. The sound was warm, alive, and so completely at odds with the desolation he had sought that it felt like a punch to the gut. He counted 3, maybe 4 distinct voices weaving together in muffled conversation. His hand went to the grip of his Colt. He hadn't come here looking for trouble, but his life had taught him that trouble was what a man usually found. The seller had lied. The property wasn't abandoned. He had walked into a mystery, a hornet's nest of someone else's secrets. Before he could decide whether to knock or retreat to announce himself or simply ride away, the decision was made for him. The front door creaked open, and a woman stepped out, a basket of mending in her hands. She stopped dead when she saw him, her eyes widening in alarm. She was not what he expected. She had auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun, and her simple calico dress, though faded, was clean and well mended. Freckles were scattered across the bridge of her nose, and her green eyes, though wide with shock, held a spark of defiance. "You must be lost," she said, her voice tight, a nervous tremor beneath the surface. "There's nothing out here for miles, except empty land and broken dreams." Wyatt slowly drew the crumpled deed from his saddlebag, the paper rustling in the wind. He held it up for her to see, a flimsy legal shield against the living reality in front of him. "Actually," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. This is my land now. I bought it fair and square." He watched her face, searching for guilt or deception. He found only a deepening confusion, quickly followed by a flash of fear that she immediately tried to conceal behind a mask of indignation. She took a step back, her hand gripping the doorframe as if for support. "That's impossible. Nobody's owned this place for years. We've been—" She stopped herself, biting her lip, her eyes darting nervously back into the shadowed interior of the house. Wyatt took a step onto the porch, the old wood groaning under his weight. His gaze fixed on her. "How many of you are living in my house?" From inside, the quiet murmur of voices ceased, abruptly replaced by the sound of hurried footsteps and hushed, urgent whispers. The woman glanced over her shoulder, then squared her shoulders and faced him. Her chin held high. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was now banked by a fierce protective fire. "My name is Eliza May," she said, her voice clear and firm. "And we are not squatters, if that's what you're thinking. We have every right to be here." Based on what, Wyatt kept his tone level, but his patience, already worn thin by grief and exhaustion, was beginning to fray. Eliza's gaze didn't waver. Based on necessity, based on survival, based on the fact that sometimes the law and what's right don't line up the way they should. The door behind her opened wider, and 4 other women emerged from the shadows, their faces a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and defiance. They formed a protective phalanx behind Eliza, their presence a silent, unified challenge. Wyatt took in the scene, 5 women alone in the middle of nowhere, living in a house he now legally owned. He had come here seeking solitude and an escape from the complexities of the world. Instead, he had stumbled right into the heart of them. Eliza saw the conflict in his eyes, the weary resignation warring with the stubborn set of his jaw. Her expression softened just a fraction. "You'd better come inside," she said, her voice losing its hard edge. She gestured toward the open door. "But I should warn you. Once you cross that threshold, there's no going back to the simple life you thought you were buying." Wyatt hesitated for only a moment, then stepped across the threshold, leaving the harsh, empty world he'd sought behind, and entering a world filled with secrets he was not yet prepared to understand. The moment Wyatt stepped inside, he understood Eliza's warning. The house was not merely occupied. It was a home. The main room was meticulously clean, warm and filled with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs. Hand-sewn curtains with a faded floral pattern framed the windows. A rough-hewn bookshelf stood against one wall filled with worn volumes. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the faces of the women who now stood before him, a silent, formidable jury. Each woman studied him, her posture and expression a map to her personality. The tension in the room was as thick as molasses. "Ladies," Eliza said, her voice the anchor in the uneasy silence. "This is Wyatt McGraw. He claims to have bought our home." A tall, dark-haired woman stepped forward. She carried herself with an air of unyielding authority, her back ramrod straight, her chin lifted. Her calm gray eyes appraised him, not as a threat, but as a problem to be solved. "I am Evelyn Shaw," she said, her voice low and steady. "And I don't care what piece of paper you're carrying, mister. This ranch has been our sanctuary for 2 years. We've planted crops, repaired the barn, and made this place livable again after it was left to rot. This is our home. And we're not leaving," a second woman added, crossing her arms over her chest. She had fiery red hair and a constellation of freckles that did nothing to soften her sharp, cynical gaze. Her stance was combative, her eyes daring him to challenge her. "I'm Rebecca Granger, and I can tell you right now that 5 determined women can make life very difficult for one stubborn man." The third woman was petite, with a cascade of blonde curls and quick, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance, and the wear on his boots, the exhaustion in his face, the way his hand hovered near the butt of his gun. "Grace Maddox," she said, her voice softer than the others, but laced with an intellectual precision. "We have heard promises before from men who claimed they could solve our problems. They all wanted something in return that we weren't willing to give." The fourth woman, the youngest of the group, remained partially hidden behind Evelyn. She was little more than a girl with wide, doe-like brown eyes and a fragile air about her. She flinched when Wyatt's gaze met hers, her shy smile vanishing as she looked away. Eliza noticed the exchange and stepped slightly in front of the girl, a subtle but clear, protective gesture. "Daisy Flynn doesn't talk to strangers." She explained, her tone a warning that brooked no argument. Wyatt removed his hat, running a hand through his sweat-matted hair. He felt outnumbered and out of his depth. He had come here to fight his own ghosts, not to evict a household of desperate women. "I understand you've made this place your home," he said, trying to find a reasonable tone. "But I have legal ownership. I'm not looking to cause trouble, but the question is, what were you all running from that brought you to a place like this?" The question landed in the room like a lit stick of dynamite. The women exchanged a series of loaded, frantic glances. Evelyn's stoic composure cracked, a flicker of old fear crossing her features. Grace bit her lip, her hands twisting nervously in the fabric of her apron. Rebecca's defiant expression faltered, replaced by a raw vulnerability. They were hiding from something or someone, and he had just blundered onto the raw nerve of their secret. It was Eliza who finally broke the suffocating silence. Her words were quiet, but they struck him with the force of a physical blow. "The same thing you're running from, I'd imagine," she said, her green eyes seeming to look straight through him, past the grit and weariness to the cowardice rotting his core. "The difference is, we found each other, and we are not about to let anyone, not the law, not you, tear apart what we've built here." A temporary truce was reached, born of mutual exhaustion and uncertainty. Wyatt agreed to sleep in the barn while they all decided what was to be done. He didn't want their home, but he had nowhere else to go. They didn't trust him, but they couldn't force him to leave. So they existed in a state of fragile suspension, circling each other like wary predators. Over the next few days, Wyatt fell into a routine of observation. From the barn, he watched the women. They were a marvel of discipline and cooperation. Evelyn was the clear leader, directing their work with quiet efficiency. Rebecca, with her fiery spirit, was the muscle handling the heavy repairs and standing guard with a shotgun never far from her reach. Grace was the strategist, managing their dwindling supplies with meticulous care and spending her evenings reading or writing in a small leather-bound journal. Eliza was the heart of the group, the mediator and nurturer, her steady presence holding them all together. And then there was Daisy, the quiet one. Wyatt watched her most of all because there was something about her that didn't fit. She wasn't just shy. She was watchful. While the others worked, she would often stand at the edge of the property, her gaze scanning the horizon, her posture unnaturally still. She moved with a silent, deliberate grace, and her eyes, which everyone assumed were cast down in timidity, missed nothing. He saw her tracing patterns in the dust, with a stick seemingly lost in thought, but he realized they weren't random doodles. They were calculations, maps, angles. Her fragility was a carefully constructed facade, a cloak of invisibility. His suspicion was confirmed on the third day. He was fixing a loose hinge on the well cover when he saw a piece of paper caught in the thorns of a nearby tumbleweed. He worked it free. It was a page torn from a ledger, filled with neat columns of numbers and names, but the entries were written in some kind of code, a complex cipher of symbols and letters. It was meticulous, complex, and utterly baffling. It was the work of a keen, analytical mind. It was Grace's handwriting, he thought at first, but the precision felt different, more mathematical. He pocketed the page, a cold knot of unease tightening in his stomach. These women weren't just hiding. They were planning. They were fighting a war he couldn't see, and their secrets were far deeper and more dangerous than a simple desire for solitude. His curiosity, long dormant, began to stir, mingling with a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He had come here to escape the world's troubles, but he was beginning to realize he had landed squarely in the middle of a conflict that made a bank robbery in Redemption Gulch look like child's play. Wyatt began to lower his guard, and in turn, so did they. He started by repairing the section of collapsed fence on the north pasture, a back-breaking task under the relentless sun. He worked without a word, expecting nothing in return. Rebecca watched him from a distance, for the first day her shotgun resting in the crook of her arm, her expression a mask of suspicion. By the third day, she brought him a canteen of fresh, cool water from the well, setting it down on a fence post before walking away without a word. It was an olive branch. The real shift came a week after his arrival. A lone drifter drawn by the smoke from their chimney rode into their valley. He was a big, slovenly man, with cruel eyes and a sense of entitlement that oozed from him like rancid grease. He dismounted, demanding food and water as if it were his right. When Eliza politely refused, his demeanor turned ugly. A bunch of women all alone out here. He sneered, his gaze crawling over them. You need a man to protect you. I reckon I could be that man. Before Rebecca could raise her shotgun, Wyatt stepped out of the barn, a heavy smithing hammer in his hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence solid and immovable, the hammer resting lightly in his grip. He met the drifter's gaze with a flat, dead-eyed stare he had perfected over years of wanting the world to leave him alone. The drifter looked from Wyatt's cold eyes to the hammer, then back again. He licked his lips, muttered a curse, and clumsily remounted his horse, kicking it into a gallop as he fled. That night, for the first time, they invited him to eat inside the house. The meal was simple stew and fresh bread, but it felt like a banquet. The tension that had defined their interactions had eased, replaced by a quiet, cautious respect. After the plates were cleared, Evelyn finally looked at him. her gray eyes searching his face. "You deserve to know the truth," she said. "You've earned that much." The women took turns speaking their voices, weaving together to tell a story of such calculated cruelty it made Wyatt's blood run cold. They were all escapees, not from prisons of stone and iron, but from gilded cages. They had been part of a sophisticated human trafficking ring run by a man who moved in high society, a man of wealth and influence named Samuel Morrison. Wyatt's hands clenched into fists under the table. The name hit him like a physical blow. The cultured voice, the cold blue eyes, the tailored black coat. It was the man from the bank. He finds girls who are desperate. Grace explained, her voice trembling slightly. Orphans, debtors, runaways. He offers them a new life, promises of good work security. But it's all a lie. He indebts them with contracts for their travel and lodging, and then he sells them. He doesn't sell them into brothels. Rebecca added, her voice laced with bitter acid. It's worse. He places them as companions or housekeepers with powerful, wealthy men across the territory. Men who believe their money buys them the right to own another person. We were his property. Eliza picked up the story. We found each other in that darkness. We planned for months. Grace, with her knack for numbers and codes, managed to steal his master ledger. It has everything. The names of the girls, the men who bought them, the illicit financial records. It's enough evidence to burn his entire empire to the ground. We ran. Evelyn concluded, her voice firm. We took the ledger and we ran. We've been looking over our shoulders ever since. A heavy silence settled over the room. The coded page Wyatt had found now made horrifying sense. It was a piece of their weapon, their only defense. Then Rebecca, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle flame, spoke again. Morrison is ruthless. He doesn't tolerate loose ends. I heard a story once about a homesteader family on the Santa Fe Trail years ago. They were sitting on a piece of land he wanted for one of his business partners. The family wouldn't sell. She paused, swallowing hard. So he had their wagon train attacked by bandits. Made it look random. The whole family was wiped out. A man, his wife, their little boy. All for a piece of dirt. The stew turned to ash in Wyatt's mouth. The room started to spin. The Santa Fe Trail. A man, his wife, their little boy. It couldn't be a coincidence. The details were too specific, too chillingly familiar. He remembered the whispers after the attack, rumors that it wasn't just random marauders, that the raid had been too organized, too precise. He had dismissed it as campfire gossip. He looked up and the women were all staring at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern at the sudden pallor of his face. He had come to this place to bury his past, to run from the ghost of Samuel Morrison. And he had run directly into the man's other victims, to the one place on earth where all the threads of his failure and Morrison's evil were destined to converge. The first terrible seed of the truth had been planted. This wasn't just their fight anymore. It had been his fight all along. He just hadn't known it. The fragile peace of the ranch was shattered 3 days later. It was Daisy who saw him first. She was perched in the loft of the barn, her usual lookout spot, when she let out a sharp, bird-like cry of warning. On the distant ridge to the east, a lone rider sat on his horse, a dark silhouette against the morning sun. He wasn't moving, just watching. A scout. The casual, patient way he observed them was more terrifying than an open charge. Morrison had found them. Inside now. Evelyn commanded, her voice sharp with urgency. They moved with the grim efficiency Wyatt had come to admire. Windows were shuttered, weapons were loaded. But this time, there was a new resolve in the air. This time they weren't just victims waiting for the inevitable. They had an ally. "He's alone," Wyatt said, peering through a crack in the barn door. "He'll ride back and report what he's seen. We can't let that happen." "What are you suggesting?" Rebecca asked, checking the load on her shotgun. "We take him," Wyatt said, quietly. The plan was simple and dangerous. Wyatt circled around through a dry creek bed that cut behind the ridge, while Rebecca and Eliza created a diversion on the far side of the property, making it seem as if they were preparing to flee. The scout, his attention fixed on the apparent panic at the ranch house, never saw Wyatt coming up behind him. Wyatt took him down without a sound, a hard blow to the back of the head, knocking him from his saddle. They dragged the unconscious man into the root cellar, binding his hands and feet. When he came to, he found himself looking up at 5 grim-faced women, and Wyatt, whose expression was as hard and cold as granite. The scout was a wiry man with shifty eyes and the arrogance of a bully who suddenly finds himself outmatched. He spat on the dirt floor. "Morrison will find you. You can't run forever." "The ledger copies?" Grace demanded, her voice shaking but determined. "We sent them to allies all over the territory. He can't get to all of them." The scout laughed, a nasty grating sound. "You think you're so smart. Morrison's been one step ahead of you this whole time. He's not just tracking you, he's been cleaning up your mess. That newspaper man in Silver Creek had a fire in his office. Marshall Davidson in Copper Ridge took an early retirement to spend time with his family down in Mexico. The schoolteacher in Pine Hollow, a tragic accident with a runaway wagon." He grinned, enjoying the look of horror dawning on their faces. "Your insurance policy's gone. Every last copy has been destroyed. You have nothing left." The women paled, their last line of defense systematically dismantled and destroyed. They were truly alone now. Wyatt stepped forward, his shadow falling over the scout. "What else?" he asked, his voice a low growl. The scout's bravado wavered under Wyatt's intense gaze. "He's coming," he stammered. "Him and 10 men. They'll be here by nightfall." Wyatt began searching the man's pockets. He pulled out a knife, a twist of tobacco, and a few coins. Then his fingers closed around something small, hard and metallic in the man's vest pocket. He pulled it out. Time stopped. It was a silver locket, oval-shaped, etched with a delicate floral pattern. It was identical to Sarah's, identical to the one ripped from the woman's neck in the bank. It was tarnished and dented, but it was unmistakable. "Now, where did you get this?" Wyatt's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a deadly weight that made the scout flinch. The man swallowed nervously. It's a trophy. The boss, he likes to collect them. Mementos from jobs. Says they remind him of his successes." The last piece of the puzzle slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Samuel Morrison, the man from the bank, the man who hunted these women, the man whose men wore bandanas and carried out random attacks on wagon trains, the man who collected silver lockets as trophies of his conquests. Wyatt held the locket in his palm, the cool metal a conduit for 5 years of repressed grief and rage. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a reckoning. His flight from the world had led him not to an escape, but to the very heart of his own personal hell. He looked from the locket to the horrified faces of the women, and he knew there was no more running. Not for him, not for them. The past he had tried to bury had just ridden over the horizon, and it was coming to collect its debts. Nightfall was coming, and with it the monster who had destroyed his life was coming to finish the job. The sky began to bleed from blue to a bruised orange, as the sun dipped toward the jagged horizon. With the setting sun came a change in the air. The wind picked up no longer a gentle sigh, but a rising, mournful howl. It kicked up swirls of dust from the parched earth, a gritty preamble to the violence that was coming. A sandstorm was brewing, a roiling wall of brown on the horizon, nature's fury mirroring their own. Then they appeared, 11 riders materializing from the dust haze like specters. They didn't charge. They moved with the patient, inexorable dread of an incoming tide spreading out to form a wide, inescapable circle around the ranch. At their center rode Samuel Morrison, his black coat a stark slash against the ochre landscape, his posture as serene as a gentleman out for an afternoon ride. The wind tore at the house, rattling the shutters and moaning through the eaves. The world outside the windows became a swirling vortex of sand and twilight, obscuring the enemy, but not their presence. The siege had begun. Morrison didn't order an attack. He was a master of a crueler warfare. He rode his horse to just outside rifle range, the wind whipping his coat around him, and he began to speak. His cultured voice, amplified by the strange acoustics of the storm, cut through the howl of the wind, a serpent's whisper meant to poison their resolve. Evelyn. He called his voice, carrying an eerie intimacy. Do you remember the governor's ball? The silk dresses, the champagne, you thought you had found a patron. You were so close to a respectable life. Surrender the ledger, and I can give you that life back. A better one. Inside, Evelyn stood ramrod straight, her face a pale stoic mask, but Wyatt saw her hands tremble where she gripped her rifle. Grace. Morrison's voice shifted, becoming softer, more patronizing. My clever little accountant. All those numbers, all that potential. Wasted in this wasteland. I have a position for you in my San Francisco office. A real future. Don't throw it away for a lost cause. Grace squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears as if to block out the insidious words that preyed on her deepest insecurities. He went through them one by one. To Rebecca, he promised a chance to direct her fire at his enemies instead of him. To Eliza, he spoke of her family back east, hinting that his reach was long and their safety depended on her cooperation. Each word was a poisoned dart, crafted to find the chinks in their armor, to remind them of the lives they'd lost and the hopes they'd abandoned. And Daisy. He said, his voice dropping to a near caress that was more chilling than any shout. My quiet little mouse. You were always my favorite. So fragile. This world is too harsh for you. Come back to me. I will protect you. I am the only one who can. A choked sob escaped Daisy's lips. She curled into a ball in the corner, her body shaking uncontrollably. Eliza rushed to her side, wrapping her in a protective embrace, murmuring words of comfort that were all but lost in the rising shriek of the storm. Wyatt watched his rage, a cold, hard knot in his gut. This was Morrison's true nature. Not just a killer and a thief, but a sadist who savored the breaking of a person's spirit more than the breaking of their body. And the stranger. Morrison called out, his voice turning mocking. The unexpected variable. I don't know who you are, friend, but you have stumbled into a private matter. Ride away now, and you will be allowed to live. Stay, and you will be buried here, another nameless casualty in a story that does not concern you. It concerns me. Wyatt muttered to himself, his hand tightening on the grip of his Colt. The silver locket in his pocket felt as heavy as a tombstone. He looked at the women huddled in the dim, dust-choked light of the lantern. Their faces were etched with terror, but beneath it, a new and terrible resolve was hardening. Morrison's psychological assault wasn't breaking them. It was forging them into steel. They were no longer running. They were cornered, but they were cornered together. The storm hit its peak. The world outside vanished into a howling, impenetrable curtain of sand. The house groaned under the assault dust, seeping through every crack. The sun was gone, swallowed by the maelstrom, plunging them into a claustrophobic orange-tinged darkness. It was under the cover of this chaos that Morrison finally gave the order. The splintering crash of the back door being kicked in was their signal. The final battle had begun. The inside of the ranch house became a maelstrom of shadow grit and violence. The howling sandstorm outside muffled the sounds of the gunfight, isolating them in their own private war. Lantern light thick with swirling dust cast long distorted shadows that danced and leaped with every muzzle flash. Morrison's men breached the defenses, pouring in through the shattered back door and splintered window frames. Rebecca's shotgun roared its blast, a thunderclap that sent 2 men reeling back into the storm. Evelyn, positioned by the main staircase, fired her rifle with methodical precision, each shot deliberate and deadly. Grace and Eliza reloaded weapons their hands, moving with a desperate, practiced speed. But they were outnumbered. For every man that fell, another took his place, their dark forms emerging from the choking dust like demons from the earth. Wyatt moved through the chaos, his Colt bucking in his hand. The years of running, of avoiding conflict, fell away. The ice in his veins had melted, replaced by a fire fueled by 5 years of grief and a lifetime of regret. He was no longer the man who froze. He was the man Sarah and Ben had needed him to be. He fought his way toward the front of the house where the main assault was concentrated. He saw a hulking shape loom out of the dust, Jedediah, the brute from the bank. The man lunged not with a gun, but with a massive knife, his face a mask of pure savagery. Wyatt fired, but the bullet only grazed the man's shoulder. Jedediah roared and slammed into him, and they crashed to the floor. The man's weight was immense, his hands like vices as they closed around Wyatt's throat. Wyatt's vision began to tunnel the frantic sounds of the gunfight, fading to a dull roar. His fingers scrabbled at his belt, finding the handle of his own knife. With the last of his strength, he drove the blade up under the man's ribs. Jedediah grunted, his grip slackening for just a second. It was enough. Wyatt twisted, throwing the man off him, and scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. And then he saw him. Samuel Morrison stood in the ruined doorway, framed against the raging storm. He was untouched by the violence, his black coat immaculate, a thin, elegant pistol in his hand. He watched the chaos with the detached interest of a theater critic. His pale blue eyes found Wyatt's through the swirling dust. And he smiled, a slow, chilling smile of recognition. "I remember you," Morrison said, his voice cutting through the din. He took a step into the room, his movements unhurried. The bank in Redemption Gulch. The man who did nothing. He took another step. "But that's not the first time, is it? I remember you from before that." He raised his pistol not at Wyatt, but at the ceiling, and fired a single shot. The blast silenced the room. His own men and the women froze, turning to look at their leader. 5 years ago, Morrison set his gaze locked on Wyatt, a terrible dawning light in his eyes. The Santa Fe Trail. A wagon train that wouldn't move off a piece of land I needed. I remember a man who looked just like you. A man who just stood and watched while his family was taken from him. The coward who watched his family die because he wouldn't fight. The world fell away. The storm, the gunfight, the women, it all vanished. There was only Morrison's voice confirming the truth Wyatt had only just begun to suspect. That was you. Morrison breathed the realization, bringing a look of genuine delight to his face. It wasn't a random attack, Mr. McGraw. It was business. Your little homestead was in the way of a railroad spur my partners were funding. You were an obstacle. I had you removed." The confession delivered with such casual cruelty shattered the last of Wyatt's restraint. With a roar of pure, animalistic rage, he launched himself at Morrison. He fired, but Morrison was faster, sidestepping the shot and bringing his own pistol up. The two men collided, crashing over a table. Morrison's pistol discharged the bullet, tearing a hot furrow along Wyatt's ribs. Pain, white-hot and blinding, flared through him, but the rage was stronger. He brought his own gun up, pressing it under Morrison's chin. But Morrison just laughed a triumphant, ugly sound. "It's over," he hissed. "Look around you. You've lost." He was right. Rebecca was down, clutching a wounded shoulder. Evelyn was out of ammunition, backed into a corner. The remaining men were closing in. All seemed lost. And then, above the unrelenting howl of the storm, another sound emerged. Faint at first, then growing steadily stronger. The rhythmic, thunderous pounding of hoofbeats. Dozens of them. Morrison's men looked up, their faces etched with confusion. "More of our men, boss," one asked. Morrison's smile faltered. He hadn't sent for reinforcements. A look of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his face as he realized what was happening. It was Daisy. She rose from her corner, no longer the trembling, frightened girl. Her eyes were clear and hard as diamonds. Her voice when she spoke was not a whisper, but a clarion call of victory that rang through the chaotic room. "You were so busy looking for the evidence of your past crimes, Mr. Morrison," she said. "You never imagined I would use the evidence of your future ones." The front door burst open. Not from Morrison's men, but from grim-faced riders in long dusters, their badges glinting in the lantern light. Federal marshals. Daisy's masterstroke was revealed in that moment, a plan of breathtaking audacity and brilliance. "Knowing you had corrupted every local lawman, I used a traveling telegraph operator 2 weeks ago. I sent a message directly to the territorial governor. It didn't contain a single page from your ledger. It contained a list of every official on your payroll, from judges to marshals, complete with dates and transaction records I memorized from your private accounts. These men," she said, gesturing to the marshals flooding the room, "are from outside the territory. They are loyal only to the governor." The quietest of them all, the one he had dismissed as a mouse, had been the one who truly checkmated the king. She hadn't just saved herself. She had dismantled his entire corrupt network with a single perfectly timed message. The game was over. Morrison had been outplayed. As the storm finally broke, its fury spent, a profound quiet descended upon the battered ranch. The wind died down to a whisper, and the clean, rain-washed scent of sage and wet earth filled the air, a natural absolution for the violence that had transpired. The federal marshals, grimly efficient, rounded up Morrison and his surviving men, their faces a mixture of disbelief and sullen defeat. Morrison didn't struggle. He stood, his fine clothes now tattered and stained, and stared at Daisy. His expression was not one of hatred, but of pure, uncomprehending shock. He couldn't process it. He, Samuel Morrison, who orchestrated the lives and deaths of men with the flick of a pen, had been undone by the scared little girl he had planned to recapture as a personal prize. How he finally asked, his voice a hoarse rasp. Daisy met his gaze without flinching. "You saw a fragile mouse," she said, her voice steady. "You should have looked for a trap." The marshals led him away. A king dethroned, his empire of cruelty crumbling into the mud. The aftermath inside the house was somber. The place was a ruin of splintered furniture, shattered glass, and the lingering scent of gunpowder. But it was secure. They were alive. They were free. Wyatt sat on the porch steps, the lead marshal having just finished dressing the gash along his ribs. The pain was a dull, throbbing ache, but it felt distant, secondary to the immense, hollowed-out calm that had settled over him. Eliza brought him a cup of coffee, her hands steady now, and sat beside him. One by one, the others joined them, tending to their own wounds and the hurts of their sisters. Rebecca's arm was in a sling, but the fire in her eyes was undimmed. Evelyn surveyed the damage to her home not with despair, but with the quiet determination of a builder ready to begin again. Grace was already making a list of what they would need to repair. They watched the sunrise, a clean, sharp line of brilliant gold on the eastern horizon. It illuminated a world washed clean, a landscape of new beginnings. For years, Wyatt had sought a sanctuary from his past. He had looked for it in isolation, in the bottom of a bottle, in the endless miles of a dusty trail. He now realized he hadn't needed a place to hide. He had needed a place to make his stand. He had found it here, not in the empty land he had purchased for $1, but in the company of these 5 unbreakable women. He had found not just a sanctuary, but a purpose. Weeks bled into one another, marked by the rhythms of reconstruction. The sound of hammers replaced the sound of gunfire. The ranch, once a fortress, slowly transformed back into a home, its scars a testament to the battle they had won. Wyatt worked alongside them, his hands once hesitant and frozen, now sure and capable. He helped rebuild the shattered door, reglaze the windows, and mend the fences. He found a quiet satisfaction in the simple, honest labor, in the act of creating something whole from something broken. He was no longer a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. One afternoon, the territorial mail rider made a special trip out to the ranch. He delivered a thick envelope for Daisy, full of official-looking documents confirming the seizure of Morrison's assets, and a small, heavy box addressed to Wyatt. The return address was the office of the territorial governor. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was the silver locket. It had been cleaned and polished, the floral etchings gleaming as they had the day he had given it to Sarah. A short, handwritten note from the governor was tucked beside it. Mr. McGraw, the enclosed was recovered from Morrison's personal effects. I believe it belongs to you. The territory is in your debt. That evening, as the 5 women sat around the hearth sharing a quiet meal, Wyatt walked over to the stone fireplace. For a moment, he simply held the locket in his hand and the cool metal, a familiar weight in his palm. He thought of burying it, of putting the past to rest once and for all. But he knew that wasn't the answer. The past wasn't something to be buried or outrun. It was something to be reconciled with, to be woven into the fabric of the present. He took a small nail from the tool pouch on the mantel and hammered it into the rough-hewn wood above the fire. He hung the locket there where the firelight could catch it. Next to it, in a small vase, was a single vibrant Indian paintbrush, a wildflower Daisy had picked for him that morning. Sarah's memory and his new future side by side. It was an act of acceptance, a declaration that he could honor the man he had been while embracing the man he was becoming. Eliza came to stand beside him, her gaze following his to the locket. She didn't speak for a long moment, simply respecting the sanctity of his private grief. Then she turned to him, her green eyes clear and serious. "We held a vote," she said softly. "It was unanimous. The deed to this land may be in your name, but the home on it is ours. All of ours. We're offering you a formal partnership, Wyatt McGraw. Equal shares in the land, the labor, and whatever future we can build here." Wyatt looked from Eliza's earnest face to the others watching him from the table. He saw Evelyn's nod of stoic approval, Rebecca's grudging but genuine smile, Grace's quiet encouragement, and Daisy's radiant, hopeful gaze. He had arrived a broken man, seeking solitude, a stranger they had every reason to fear. And now they were offering him the one thing he thought he had lost forever, a family. He reached out and shook Eliza's hand, his grip firm. "I accept," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He was no longer a landlord, no longer a hired gun or a temporary protector. He was home. The last light of day streamed through the newly repaired window, illuminating the six of them gathered together. Outside, the vast western sky deepened to a shade of violet, dotted with the first courageous stars of evening. They were a patchwork family forged in trauma and bound by resilience, standing together against the encroaching darkness, ready to face the dawn.